presidency has beckoned to national heroes. Renowned for their service in time of war, they seem to many to stand above politics, holding out the possibility of a special kind of leadership. 12 generals have held the highest office. Their performances varied widely, but each entered the presidency with heroic possibilities, and none more so than did our nation's first president, General George Washington.
Any memoirs of my life, unconnected with the general history of the Revolutionary War, would rather hurt my feelings than tickle my pride.
His life is inextricably linked to the Revolution, but over time it has been largely forgotten that George Washington's almost mythical heroism sprang from very human qualities, his character and his vision.
My politics are plain and simple. I think every nation has a right to establish a government of the people. And I think I see a path as clear and direct as a ray of light.
A farmer's son from Tidewater, Virginia, from early on, George Washington was drawn to the military. He was tall, enormously strong, and had distinguished himself during the French and Indian War as a national hero. In the years that followed, a Virginia plantation called Mount Vernon became home to this Indian fighter turned farmer. Overseeing thousands of acres, he turned himself into one of the country's wealthiest citizens, marrying a rich and socially prominent widow, Martha Custis. Rather than intellectual or imaginative, George Washington was pragmatic and thorough. Easily embarrassed by his lack of learning, he was not a good conversationalist and had a legendary temper. At age 43, he reluctantly agreed to serve as commander-in-chief during the Revolutionary War, but never considered himself a professional soldier, just a citizen defending his country.
A kind of destiny has thrown me upon this service. It was utterly out of my power to refuse.
He headed a continental army made up of his fellow countrymen, and for 8 years he led his men with unwavering determination and a refusal to ever give up.
There are remarkable aspects of George Washington during the Revolutionary War, which was a very hard war, a war that went on for a very long time. It wasn't his generalship per se, but he attended to his men. He stuck by his men. His men had the feeling that he cared about them, respected them, would do for them whatever he could, and would share their hardships, which were severe. That inspiration of trust is the special characteristic of the general, and there aren't so many people around every day that one knows with whom to compare him.
At war's end, Washington was approached to join an armed rebellion against Congress and then serve as king of the new nation.
You could not have found a person to whom your schemes are more disagreeable. Banish these thoughts from your mind.
When he heard rumors that his unpaid and disgruntled officers were planning a military coup d'etat, he asked them to meet with him at Newburgh, New York.
Gentlemen, as I was among the first to embark in the cause of our common country, as I never left your side one moment, it can scarcely be supposed that I am indifferent to your interests. But this dreadful alternative of either deserting our country in the extremest hour of her distress or turning arms against it has something so shocking in it that humanity revolts from the idea. I spurn it, as every man who regards liberty undoubtedly does.
A silence passed over the assembled group. Then Washington drew out a letter addressing the soldiers' grievances. But the aging commander could not read the text, and was forced to resort to a pair of eyeglasses.
Gentlemen, you'll permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country.
This simple gesture broke the ice between them and brought tears to the eyes of his men. Washington had shamed the conspirators out of their plot.
This whole episode reveals the essential quality of Washington as a person of self-motivation and self-restraint. Once the Revolutionary War was over, Washington gave up his commission as General-in-Chief and went back to Mount Vernon as a private citizen. Many other countries that have had generals come to the helm have had generals rule as generals, as military dictators. Nothing like that happened here. That was not in any way an accident. He wanted the precedent set, and it had an immense effect.
It is said that every man has his portion of ambition. I may have mine, I suppose, as well as the rest, but I have no lust for power.
4 years later, Washington reluctantly agreed to come out of retirement and preside at a congressional convention in Philadelphia. Here he helped shape a new national constitution, which called for a single chief executive to be known as president. All knew that there was only one man who could fill the position, and in the following year, an unopposed George Washington was unanimously elected.
My leaving home to take this office was the greatest personal sacrifice I have ever been called upon to make. I feel very much like a man who is condemned to death does when the time of his execution draws near.
On April 30th, 1789, the 57-year-old war hero, dressed in a dark brown suit and wearing a steel-hilted dress sword, stood on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York. There, before a great crowd below, he recited the oath the Constitution had mandated, adding his own prayer at the end, "So help me God."
I walk on untrodden ground. There's scarcely any part of my conduct which may not hereafter be drawn into precedent.
Washington was very conscious that the presidency had to be translated from abstract words on paper into a living reality, and that he had to be the mechanism. A sort of a kingship without a king, and he had to make it real. But a great many of the people who came in contact with him in those presidential years, while respecting him, while admiring his dignity and his deference to civilian tradition and all the rest of it, found him pretty hard to take.
Appearing in formal dress at weekly public receptions, President Washington would bow and speak to each guest, but never become so familiar as to shake hands. He called his advisors his first characters and invented the presidential cabinet. It was his idea. And on a wild tract of land along the Potomac River, he chose the location for a new capital city that would one day bear his name. He himself laid the cornerstone for the Capitol building and picked out the site for what would become the White House. And to make it absolutely clear that the president was not a king, he backed away from wielding too much power, refusing to interfere with Congress.
To please everybody is impossible. Were I to undertake it, I should probably please nobody.
When war broke out between France and Britain, Washington opposed taking sides in the conflict, issuing a proclamation of neutrality. His peaceful approach to politics ultimately hurt him, and throughout his second term, he was vilified for his refusal to take sides in the European conflict.
I was accused of being the enemy of one nation and subject to the influence of another, and in such exaggerated and indecent terms as could scarcely be applied to a common pickpocket.
March 3, 1797, was George Washington's final day in office. Setting the precedent for a two-term limit and the civil transfer of power, he had written, "I shall resign the chair of government without a single regret."
George Washington displayed enormous self-discipline and an enormously commendable understanding of the need to relinquish power when the time was ripe. These are not qualities that Americans have classically been known for, but they are qualities that Americans have admired and wished to see in their government from the time when he first became, created, devised the presidency of the United States.
By the time he left office, the country had formed its own national character, in large part by borrowing George Washington's. And when he died just 3 years later at age 67, an emotional tribute on the floor of Congress summed him up this way: "First in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen."
I shall carry to my grave the hope that the Constitution may be sacredly maintained, and that free government, the ever-favorite object of my heart, will be the happy reward of our mutual cares, labors, and dangers.
The generation after Washington produced two more soldier presidents. The first was Andrew Jackson, a hugely popular war hero elected in 1828. Then, 12 years later, came America's most unlikely hero president, William Henry Harrison. Few Americans knew much about this 68-year-old former fighter when he first appeared on the national scene.
The high office was never for a moment the object of my ambition. I would have preferred to remain with my family in our log cabin, rather than becoming engaged in political disputes.
William Henry Harrison played the role of humble, backwoods hero, but he was actually a descendant of one of the oldest and most distinguished families in America, a classically educated Virginian whose father had been a signer of the Declaration of Independence. As a young man with a commission signed by George Washington, he was sent to help patrol the western frontier.
My sword is almost my only patrimony, but while I wear that sword and the livery of my country, I will not disgrace them.
In 1798, he entered politics, and by age 27, he was governor of the newly created territory of Indiana, a post he held for the next 12 years. During this time, he built a luxurious governor's mansion, which became known as Grouseland. Here, William Harrison's principal duty was to oversee relations with Native Americans and to obtain for the government as much land as possible.
By my own personal exertions in securing the friendship of the chiefs by admitting them at all times to my house and table, my propositions for the purchase of their lands were successful beyond my most sanguine hopes. In the course of 7 years, the title was extinguished to the amount of 50 million acres.
But on August 12, 1810, the Shawnee leader Tecumseh descended upon the governor's mansion and warned that his people would no longer sit still if their lands were threatened again.
Tecumseh vowed that it was his object to form a combination of all the Indian tribes to stop the encroachment of the white people. that they were determined to make a stand where they were.
When Harrison learned that more than 500 warriors had joined Tecumseh along the banks of the Tippecanoe River in northwestern Indiana, he personally led troops there and prepared for battle. But before dawn, the Indians attacked first.
Indians were in the camp before many of my men could get out of their tents. Confusion for a short time prevailed, but aided by the officers, I was soon enabled to form the men in order. About daylight, the enemy were finally put to flight. Our killed and wounded amounted to 179.
Harrison's political enemies called it a horrible butchery and charged him with military incompetence. But over the years, his victory at Tippecanoe became increasingly romanticized as one of the great episodes of American heroism. And it was this myth that helped position Harrison for high office.
The qualities of the general and the hero must be devoted to the advantage of mankind.
28 years after the battle, Tippecanoe became the rallying cry for the presidency. In an era when political party leaders controlled presidential elections, Harrison was cleverly packaged by the Whig Party, not just as a war hero, but as a reluctant candidate from the backwoods.
They say that he lives in a cabin and that he drinks hard cider too. Well, what if he does? I am certain he's the hero of Tippecanoe.
When John Tyler of Virginia was named Harrison's vice presidential running mate, their rousing campaign slogan became Tippecanoe and Tyler too.
So again and again, fill your glasses.
Harrison's campaign became the best organized and most exciting ever seen to that time. Music and whiskey and coonskin caps swamped every hamlet. Barbecue smoke, banners, and balloon rides filled the air.
It is the ball that's rolling on for Tippecanoe and Tyler too.
In Cleveland, a group of Whigs created a huge tin ball, which they proceeded to push all the way to the state capital of Columbus. Keep the ball rolling became the Harrison motto, the ball that would roll over the Democrats in November.
William Henry Harrison is so hidden by the propaganda that his party made of him in the election that it's hard to get back to what seems to have been a very pleasant, rather cultivated, sensible, not brilliant person. A person whom anybody might have enjoyed meeting, and few would have been overwhelmed by.
Drawing out an astonishing 82% of all eligible voters, Harrison ended up with 53% of the vote and swamped his opponent in the Electoral College.
You now perceive that stories that I am a very decrepit old man are false. I am not the old man on crutches, nor the imbecile they say I am.
But in fact, Harrison was exhausted and frail when he packed for Washington. And when he said goodbye to his fellow townspeople, he seemed to instinctively know that he would not be coming back.
This may be the last time I have the pleasure of speaking to you on earth or seeing you. I bid you farewell. If forever, fare thee well.
On Inauguration Day, it was windy and cold. Refusing to wear a coat or a hat, he became thoroughly chilled during his 2-hour inaugural address, which would lead to his contracting pneumonia. But for those in the huge crowd there to hear him speak, as well as those who would read his words in the newspapers, he did his best to make the country feel good about itself.
He was what we would call now a relatively healing figure. And if he'd understood that, which for all I know he might have, then he might have used it to effect, as many years later General Eisenhower certainly did. I think he was just a good, if you will, senior civil servant. dressed up in uniform. And we'll never know if he was more than that because the poor man died after 1 month in office.
He was the country's first president to die in office, and his death helped establish a new precedent for the orderly transfer of power to the vice president. Harrison's final words, spoken to a doctor just 31 days after taking office, may have been for Vice President John Tyler.
Sir, I wish you to understand the true principles of government. I wish them carried out. I ask nothing more.
Harrison's presidency was part of a national trend. Between 1824 and 1856, every presidential election except for one included a major military hero, appealing to a public increasingly distrustful of politicians. And in the aftermath of the Civil War, the country turned to one of the greatest military leaders the nation ever produced, Ulysses S. Grant.
I have never quite forgiven myself for resigning the command of the Army to accept the presidency without any previous training. War and politics are so different.
His story contains an important warning that the capacities for presidential leadership do not always reside in military heroism. For Grant's presidency was a miserable experience. But his failure in the White House didn't come as a surprise to those who knew him back in the old days in Galena, Illinois. For in his early years, nearly everything Grant ever attempted ended in failure.
From my earliest recollections, my father carried on the manufacture of leather. I detested the trade, and my father had to use his authority to make me go to West Point. The S in my name stands for nothing. It was a mistake made when application was made to West Point.
After graduation from the academy, Grant went on to fight in the Mexican War, and when he returned home, neighbors remembered a man who drank too much and suffered long bouts of depression. One friend once said, "I was almost ashamed to speak to him, he looked so bad." Friends spoke of his expressionless face and vacant eyes. The extraordinary and troubling fact about Grant was that the only thing that ever aroused him was war.
I remember my own feelings about the Civil War when it commenced. I could not endure the thought of the Union separating. It was this feeling that compelled me to volunteer.
Because of public knowledge about his drinking, Grant was slow to gain a commission in the Army. But once in place, he led his men with such confidence, he was promoted to general.
A successful general needs health and youth and energy. I had a physique that could stand anything. Whether I slept on the ground or in a tent, whether I slept 1 hour or 10 made no difference. I could lie down and sleep in the rain without caring.
Once during the Vicksburg campaign, charges of drunkenness were leveled against him. An aide to the Secretary of War sent to investigate reported that Grant was too valuable a general for such stories to be paid attention to. President Lincoln agreed.
I am sober as a deacon, no matter what is said to the contrary.
By 1864, he was promoted to the rank of lieutenant general. No one since George Washington had ever held this permanent rank. Grant now had the full responsibility for conducting war. Standing just 5 feet 7 inches, weighing 150 pounds, and smoking as many as 20 cigars a day, Grant looked less like an imposing general than like the hundreds of thousands of ordinary soldiers who came to trust him as one of them. A taciturn man of long silences and immobile features, he had a stomach for violence.
President Lincoln once said he did not care to know what I wanted to do. He wished me to beat Lee. How I did it was my own matter. Here then was the basis of all plans. First, to use the greatest number of troops practicable against the enemy. And second, to hammer continuously at the enemy and his resources, until by mere attrition, if in no other way, there should be nothing left to him.
The qualities that the Civil War brought out of him: absolute dogged determination, enormous capacity to take physical deprivation, a willingness to inflict pain and see it inflicted, a willingness to use and lose troops. There was a very hard edge to him. He was a fighting general, someone who saw, and saw increasingly, that the way to win battles was to throw men into action, whatever the losses. It's not very pretty, and it's not high, fancy strategy, but it worked.
Grant returned to his hometown of Galena at war's end to a hero's welcome, and by 1868, the Republican Party convinced him to run for president.
I certainly never had either ambition or taste for political life, but nothing so popularizes a candidate for high position as military victories.
An adoring public wrongly assumed that Grant's proven capacity for leadership in wartime would translate into an ability to handle the job of the presidency, and he was overwhelmingly elected. Once in the White House, Grant showed concern for the plight of Black Americans, especially in the South. Having fought alongside black soldiers in the Civil War and having helped slaves gain their freedom as American citizens, he didn't want to see them robbed of their new rights.
My civil career commenced at a most critical time. In some localities in the southern states, bands of men, masked and armed, had made their appearance. Properly known as Ku Klux Klans, their objects were by force and terror to deprive colored citizens of the right to a free ballot, to suppress schools in which colored children were taught, and to reduce the colored people to a condition closely akin to that of slavery.
Grant did his level best to carry out the legislation of his party with respect to the South. He did that without hesitation. But he got in a lot of trouble for letting one of his finest qualities, loyalty, which made him absolutely indispensable to Abraham Lincoln, lead him astray in relations with numbers of the people he appointed to high office, who indulged in the great custom of the time, which was corruption. Once he'd placed trust in a man, he tended loyally to keep it in a man far longer than any president should.
Grant regularly ventured over to the lobby of nearby Willard's Hotel to smoke his cigars, and people learned to come by to try and influence him. He naively allowed himself to be used by so many unscrupulous individuals that his reputation was ridiculed by the press.
I was the subject of abuse and slander scarcely ever equaled in political history, with charges openly made of corruption on the part of the president or those employed by him. I say I don't care for what the papers say, but I do.
It was soon clear Grant possessed little of the firmness he had shown in the Army. His vision for Reconstruction was often unclear, and he vacillated on issues, even in his commitment to the problems of blacks in the South. Although he was personally honest, his administration was scandal-ridden. He was as deaf to misdoings as his ear was to music. He could barely recognize "Hail to the Chief."
Mistakes have been made, and I admit, but failures have been errors of judgment, not of intent. In every instance, I acted from a conscientious desire to do what was right.
Grant was never able to put an end to the graft and corruption that continued to undermine his entire presidency. And by the end of his 2 terms in the White House, every single one of his executive departments had come under congressional investigation.
I never wanted to get out of a place as much as I did to get out of the presidency.
But getting out of the presidency didn't end Grant's bad luck. In a run for a 3rd term in 1880, Grant failed to obtain the Republican nomination, and that loss was followed by another humiliation. Always trusting others more than he should, he became the victim of a stupendous Wall Street fraud, which left him utterly bankrupt.
Financially, the Grant family is ruined.
Desperate to provide for his wife and children, he took the advice of his friend Mark Twain and began writing his memoirs as a source of income. But he had barely begun work when a final crisis threatened. During the summer of 1884, he was eating a piece of fruit. He grabbed his throat and exclaimed, "I think something has stung me from that peach." Grant's cigar habit had caught up with him. He had throat cancer. And within a year, as he worked furiously to complete his memoirs at a cottage in the Adirondacks, Grant knew the end was near. "There cannot be a hope of going far beyond this time," he confessed.
It is nearly impossible for me to swallow. It pains me even to talk. I can feel plainly that my system is preparing for dissolution in 3 ways. 1 by hemorrhages, 1 by strangulation, and the 3rd by exhaustion.
The tragedy in Grant's final years is striking. The memoirs he wrote in the 1880s are brilliant. He wrote in extreme pain and barely got it done before he died. So that this extraordinary piece of lasting literary value, this work of his, was done in the worst possible circumstances. But he was a loyal man, and he was loyal to his family, and he had to provide for them, and this was the only way he could do it. So he forced himself to stay alive until he had it done.
Perhaps not surprisingly, Grant chose to write almost nothing at all about the loneliness and misery of his early life, and he commented only briefly on events of his presidency. Instead, he wrote about the only time in his life he had truly succeeded: in war.
It seems that one man's destiny in this world is quite as much a mystery as it is like to be in the next. Now, scarcely 20 years after the war, we seem to have forgotten the lessons it taught. But this war was a fearful lesson and should teach us the necessity of avoiding wars in the future. The condition of the colored man and the question of suffrage remains one of the grave problems of our future. But I feel that we're on the eve of a new era when there is to be great harmony. I cannot stay to be a living witness to the correctness of this prophecy, but I feel it within me that it is to be so.
Republican war heroes occupied the White House for much of the remainder of the century, though rarely with distinction. And after Theodore Roosevelt, Every president during the first half of the 20th century was a civilian. Then came the hero of World War II, General Dwight David Eisenhower. No general in history ever faced as complex or momentous a military assignment. Eisenhower was the Allied commander of all European forces, overseeing an invasion of Europe against Hitler's toughest defenses. In June 1944, it was Eisenhower who gave the official order that launched D-Day.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the Great Crusade. You will bring about the destruction of the German war machine. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well trained. He will fight savagely. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking.
It was the largest amphibious assault in history, involving 250,000 soldiers, sailors, and airmen. And Hitler's Atlantic Wall was breached.
The Allied force, which invaded Europe on June 6, 1944, has utterly defeated the Germans by land, sea, and air.
When he returned home after the war, the public response to Eisenhower was overwhelming. He was a hero who seemed to exactly fit his times, a humble, honest, clean-cut kind of man the country just felt good about.
I am not the hero. I am the symbol of the heroic men you people and all the United States have sent to war.
No general we have had, except possibly Andrew Jackson, had as much popularity as Ike did. He exuded friendliness, interest, goodwill. But he was also a person of considerable inner reserve, a man of prodigious temper, a more complicated and less friendly fellow than he seemed to be. I think you have a very complex personality under that very attractive exterior.
Like most people, I am a man of a considerable temper. But I learned long ago, many years ago, that the one thing that is damaging to anybody that aspires to a position of leadership of any kind, he must learn to control his temper.
Nicknamed Little Ike as a boy, he had learned to suppress his anger at West Point. And as a career military man, he believed what Grant had believed, that war and politics don't mix. Now, after World War II, and at the height of his popularity, Eisenhower refused to let his name be entered for the 1948 presidential campaign. It wasn't until 4 years later that his supporters finally convinced him to run.
I accept your summons. I will lead this crusade.
Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington. We've got to get where we are going.
The first campaign, of course, was quite an adventure. It was something completely strange in the life of a soldier.
Unlike Grant, Eisenhower proved to be a skilled politician. He threw himself into the presidential race as if it were an Allied invasion. And when he vowed to personally end Truman's war in Korea, Eisenhower easily won the election.
When I came to the presidency, the country was rather in an unhappy state. I tried to create an atmosphere of greater serenity and mutual confidence. You go through 3.5 years of active warfare, and with something can happen every minute. It's a thing that you have to learn to live with. And I had to, in a different way, learn the same lesson in the White House.
Ike gave the country a real sense of trust in the 1950s. As the first president to have press conferences filmed for television, it didn't matter that he was inarticulate, often mixing up his words. It was all part of his charm.
I'm going to try to be just as truthful as I can be. And I believe this. I think even people who wouldn't classify themselves probably as my political enemies do believe I'm honest. They may call me stupid, but I think they think I'm honest.
At cabinet meetings, Eisenhower rarely spoke. While others gave reports, the president listened and doodled. His presidential style was the antithesis of that of his predecessor, Harry Truman. Ike instituted layer upon layer of executive bureaucracy. It was all part of his military-style reorganization of the White House.
Mr. Truman used to sit at his desk and tap his desk for emphasis and say, Eisenhower, he'll sit here and he'll say, do this, do that, and nothing will happen. Poor Ike, it won't be a bit like the Army.
But while Eisenhower may have appeared out of touch, in fact, he secretly stayed involved in every important decision. It would later become known as his hidden hand presidency. He stabilized the economy, expanded Social Security, accelerated the space program, and supported federal school and highway programs.
One of the things about the presidency is the way you have to be prepared to jump just like a mountain sheep from one jag to another jag, and you're always on the alert. You have to be.
Eisenhower ended the fighting in Korea and strengthened NATO, developing a reputation over time as a man of peace. He believed that personal diplomacy was the best way to diffuse foreign crises. Traveling the world aboard the brand new presidential jet, Air Force One, he called what he did waging peace.
If you're keeping a peace, if you were, in other words, keeping a war from breaking out, that is waging peace.
Increasingly sensitive to the danger of nuclear war, Ike proposed that the United States and the Soviet Union open their respective airspace and share their nuclear stockpiles. And he invited Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev to Washington and convinced him to join him at a summit in Paris to discuss a ban of all nuclear testing. It was the first major step towards diffusing the high level of nuclear tensions in the world.
All presidents since nuclear weapons came on the scene have been edgy, nervous, worried, sick about engaging military forces. Ike was always in a position where, if necessary, he could let his military judgment override that of his military advisors. And in each of the tests which might have led to hostilities, which came along during his administration, Ike came down on the side of holding off, or exercising care in a fashion which kept him personally out of political trouble.
Eisenhower's caution as president was at least in part self-serving. Throughout his presidency, he skillfully avoided political issues that could tarnish his heroic image. In the controversial area of defense, he soft-pedaled his convictions on disarmament. He cut military spending, yet he preached a philosophy of peace through strength and secretly approved U-2 spy missions to photograph Russian missile sites. It wasn't until he was wrongly accused of allowing the U.S. to fall behind the Soviets in missile production that the public saw for itself the harsher side of Eisenhower's complex personality.
If anybody believes that I have deliberately misled the American people, I'd like to tell him to his face what I think about him. This is a charge that I think is despicable, and I get tired of saying that defense is to be made an excuse for wasting dollars. I don't believe we should pay 1 cent for defense more than we have to. But I do say this, our defense is not only strong, it is awesome.
Although Eisenhower publicly criticized America's nuclear buildup, it was largely just talk. He stood by as the country's nuclear arsenal grew from 1,000 warheads to 18,000. And he persisted in activities that potentially could undermine his peace efforts with the Soviets. Just 1 week before the Paris Peace Summit, he approved one last U-2 reconnaissance flight into Russian airspace.
I was sure that sooner or later we're going to have a U-2, we're going to have this whole thing discovered. But the information we were getting was so valuable that I continued.
During that last mission, the U-2 plane was shot down by the Soviets. At first, Eisenhower denied knowledge of the spying mission, then finally admitted that it was he who had authorized it. At the Paris Peace Summit, an angry Nikita Khrushchev ridiculed Ike's reputation for honesty, then stormed out. Eisenhower was devastated. His final opportunity to leave a lasting legacy of disarmament had failed.
Looking back on 8 years, you say, well, now, what did we get done? You have to recognize the political conditions under which they were done.
Ike was very good at issues of peace and war when he could deal with them without involving public commitments of his own prestige, his own popularity, his own approval. Much more hesitant when it came to that.
Ike's was an extraordinary presidency as he presided over an extended era of peace and prosperity. But by the time he bid farewell to his country, even he recognized that he had allowed nuclear proliferation to spin dangerously out of control.
Disarmament is a continuing imperative. I confess that I laid down my official responsibilities in this field with a definite sense of disappointment. As one who has witnessed the horror and the lingering sadness of war, as one who knows that another war could utterly destroy this civilization, I wish I could say tonight that a lasting peace is in sight. Now, on Friday noon, I am to become a private citizen. I am proud to do so. I look forward to it. Thank you, and good night.
In many ways, he was the embodiment of the American dream. The small-town boy who rose to heroism and then brought both grace and dignity to the highest office in the land. But unlike Washington, who in the end was willing to risk his popularity for his principles, Eisenhower was not. For while he genuinely wanted a more peaceful world, he was unwilling to put his reputation on the line on behalf of disarmament.
I have no doubt he could have been elected for a third term had he chosen to run and had the Republicans not made the great mistake of passing a constitutional amendment which forbade him to do so. Ike remained immensely popular till his dying day. But I am rendered nervous by the concept of the hero, the general, the man who represents honor and duty, not the grubby exchanges of politics. He steps off his pedestal and becomes president. Yet I have to admit that on the occasions that we've indulged ourselves in heroes from outside, we have not done too badly.
America has turned to war heroes for more than a third of its presidents, and military men who reach the high office most often have acted with military restraint. Still, Americans retain a measure of skepticism about soldier presidents, and in time of crisis and impending war, the country usually elects civilians and not generals. But America itself was born in war, and her first, and many say greatest president, was himself a general. And so at regular intervals, we return to our origins, raising to high leadership the military hero.